a world of hollowed caverns and endless corridors, of rooms carved by hand and sealed by time. In nearly every culture on Earth, people have dug down, sometimes for safety, sometimes for faith, and sometimes for reasons we still do not understand. For millennia, human beings have shaped the earth beneath them into refuge and fortress, sanctuary and tomb. They have left behind entire cities buried in stone, subterranean networks that could sustain thousands, temples chiseled from the bedrock of belief, and secret passageways running for miles through darkness. These were not mere shelters. They were worlds unto themselves, mirroring life above, but bound to silence and shadow. History tells us that necessity first drove humanity underground. The soft volcanic tuff of Cappadocia gave rise to vast refuges like Derinkuyu, 18 stories of living rock where tens of thousands once hid from war. In Italy, Etruscans tunneled through the same stone they built upon, while in the deserts of Jordan, the Nabateans carved temples and crypts that still glow rose-red in the dying light. On distant continents, from China's Cold War bunkers to the labyrinths beneath Mexico's ancient pyramids, people kept returning to the same instinct: to dig, to hide, to endure. Yet beneath these practical reasons runs a deeper mystery. Across myth and religion, countless peoples tell of civilizations that lived below the surface, hidden nations that survived floods and fires, or gods who descended into the underworld to judge the dead. The Hopi of North America speak of ancestors sheltered by ant people during a cosmic catastrophe. Greek poets imagined Hades beneath the soil, mirrored in Egyptian and Sumerian beliefs. Even in modern times, explorers whisper about Agartha or Shambhala, lost cities said to gleam somewhere in the world's depths. We tend to think of civilization as a story written above ground, in temples and towers. But this book begins where light fades. Beneath cities and fields, in stone chambers filled with stale air and echoes, lie forgotten empires and the remains of desperate ingenuity. What compelled ancient hands to carve miles of tunnels without steel or dynamite? What beliefs, fears, or hopes drove them downward, farther than safety required? As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. If you enjoy this channel, please consider leaving a comment and subscribing. It's the easiest way to support what we're doing, and it's completely free. I really appreciate it. Now, let us begin. The first time a beam of modern light touched the deeper rooms of Derinkuyu, it did not belong to an archaeologist. In the winter of 1963, a man in the Cappadocian village of Derinkuyu took a hammer to a basement wall in order to make a little more space. The wall gave way, and behind it he found not a neighbor's cellar but a narrow rock passage that curved into darkness. Word reached the local authorities, then the museums, and soon surveyors were lowering themselves into a network that seemed to have no natural end. The villagers had always known that the ground beneath their homes was soft stone, easy to carve and riddled with small caves. Few imagined that they were living over the apertures of an entire buried city. Cappadocia is a land shaped by fire and time. Millions of years ago, volcanoes in central Anatolia threw out thick sheets of ash that settled as tuff, a soft rock that is as easy to carve as a firm cheese, yet strong enough to hold a roof if you leave the right pillars. Wind and water then went to work on the surface, sculpting buttresses and funnels, and creating the famous stone towers called fairy chimneys. People moved into this landscape long before the Roman Empire. They learned to hollow the cliff faces into houses and churches, and to cut the ground into cisterns and storehouses. Derinkuyu is the largest and perhaps the most astonishing expression of that craft. What began as the solving of simple problems of shelter and water in a vulnerable place eventually became a hidden metropolis that could sustain a town through siege and flight. Modern explorers counted level after level. The current consensus holds that Derinkuyu descends as many as 18 stories, to a depth on the order of 80 meters. Not every level is open today, and not every corridor has been mapped to its end. But what has been cleared reveals a coherent plan. This is not a rabbit warren cut by panic. It is a city laid out with expertise. The rooms are rectangular and regular. Stairways are narrow and steep to slow intruders. The ceilings are low, which conserves effort and helps the rock hold its strength. Floors are linked in vertical stacks, and long arterials connect the stacks so that movement can continue even if one corridor is blocked. The city's essential services are placed with care. Kitchens sit near major passageways, identifiable by soot stains, and the presence of small alcoves for vessels. Communal rooms with benches carved from the rock can be read as schools or meeting places. A long chamber with stone installations is interpreted as a winery, evidence of daily life continuing beneath the ground. Animal stalls appear on the upper levels, where fresh air is easier to draw. Deep within, a cruciform room with an apse suggests a church from the Byzantine period. Wells reach into the aquifer, and a central ventilation shaft descends through multiple floors, a stone lung that allowed tens of thousands to breathe. Along with that principal shaft are many narrower ones, some piercing the surface to draw air, others stopping short in order to avoid giving away the city with obvious openings. The most haunting features are the doors. At many choke points sit circular stones as broad as a person is tall, shaped like millstones but without the central hole. Each is mounted in a shallow groove, so that a single defender can lever the disc into place and seal a passage with one push. The stone plugs can only be rolled from the inside, and each one has a small slot at face height, so that a spear can be thrust at an enemy who reaches an arm through. If an outer corridor was breached, the community could retreat inward and lock a level behind them. This is defense by design rather than by improvisation. Who first carved Derinkuyu remains a matter of scholarly debate. Tools and traces are difficult to date in this kind of rock. The earliest cutting may have begun in the late 2nd millennium before the Common Era, when the Hittite Empire dominated Anatolia, or in the early 1st millennium under Phrygian influence. Those were ages of both war and migration. The plateau lay along routes coveted by states to the east and the west. A community that could vanish into the ground during a raid was a community that could endure. Later layers belong more certainly to the Roman and Byzantine periods. As Christianity took hold, refugees used the subterranean spaces as sanctuaries. Frescoes and carved crosses show that people prayed and worshipped here, not only hid. During the long centuries of conflict between Byzantine forces and Arab armies, the underground cities of Cappadocia offered what the barren surface could not. Within them, families could outlast a season of danger. Archaeology recovers more than a defensive strategy. The rock retains the prints of daily life. In storage chambers, niches for oil lamps line the walls, a reminder that the city ran on points of light and careful rationing of fuel. Carved troughs show where animals were watered. In several places the floor is pocked with shallow pits that once held jars of grain. A warren of small square cells, each with low perches, functioned as a dovecote. Pigeons were kept for meat and for their droppings, which made effective fertilizer in a poor soil. The underground city was not a mere shelter of last resort. It was a planned refuge with food systems, water, energy, worship, and even industry. The scale of Derinkuyu suggests a population far larger than the village that sits above it today. Estimates vary, but the complex is widely believed to have provided space for about 20,000 people, with room for animals and stores as well. That number should be treated as an upper limit rather than a census. Not every chamber would have been filled, and living underground for extended periods would have required strict management of air and waste. Yet the size alone conveys the intention. This was a regional ark, not a private hideout. The geology of Cappadocia allowed such ambition. Tuff is riddled with natural joints and layers, and it can be carved with simple iron tools. The builders learned to read the stone. They left pillars where the rock showed weakness and followed bedding planes to minimize collapses. Even so, the work required patience and generational effort. A level might begin as a few rooms and a passage, then slowly expand as conditions demanded. Derinkuyu was never truly finished, because the threats that justified it never truly ended. From the Hellenistic era, to the raids of Central Asian horsemen, to the upheavals of late medieval Anatolia, people kept returning to the earth when armies crossed the plateau. Connections between Derinkuyu and neighboring underground cities form another layer of mystery. Cappadocia contains scores of such complexes, some small and others sprawling. Kaymakli, a few miles to the north, is the second best known. Oral tradition in the region remembers tunnels that once linked one settlement to another. It is easy to imagine couriers moving unseen from town to town, and there are places where long corridors appear to run toward those neighbors. Whether continuous passageway ever truly connected the cities, or whether those corridors are simply parallel efforts along the same geologic veins, remains a subject for cautious study. The romance of a continental subway should not outrun the evidence. Yet all the same, the pattern reveals a culture that invested its labor not only in the view above, but in the safety below. Derinkuyu's story contains a modern chapter of concealment and rediscovery. After the Ottoman period, the underground cities fell out of regular use. Entrances collapsed or were sealed. Families forgot the deeper passages that lay beneath their courtyards. It took a chance renovation to open the first door again. Once the find became public, teams moved quickly to stabilize the corridors, to map reachable rooms, and to make a portion of the city safe for visitors. The state cleared collapses and added modern lights to routes that could bear foot traffic. Yet much of Derinkuyu remains unlit and unentered. There are rooms that have not felt air for centuries. There are turns that end in rockfalls that may hide still more chambers. Even in the 21st century, the site is a working excavation more than it is a finished museum. Visitors who descend today notice a change in the senses. The air grows cooler and drier. Sounds dampen into a hush. The rock holds the day's heat, but never grows warm. The human voice, when raised, bounces as if the corridors themselves are listening. You begin to understand what it meant to live here in earnest. Families would have navigated by the glow of oil and by memory. Children would have learned the turns by counting doorways to a fountain, or by the way the ceiling lowered at a certain stair. The city's design controlled panic by making movement purposeful. Narrow stairs allowed only one or two to pass at a time. Junctions forced decisions, and always the stone doors waited, the last resort against fear. What forced people below ground is not a single enemy, but a condition of life on a frontier. This region of Anatolia has been marched over by Hittite princes, Persian kings, Roman legions, Arab commanders, Seljuk sultans, and Mongol generals. The roads between empires run through Cappadocia. In a place so frequently caught between powers, a community that could vanish had an advantage. The underground city turns geography into strategy. The tuft that looks like a weakness becomes a shield. The landscape that invites invasion also provides a place to wait it out. In this sense, Derinkuyu is a work of political engineering, as much as it is a feat of architecture. It is also a testament to the ordinary genius of people who had no modern machines. Tuff can be cut with hand tools, but hauling out the spoils is grueling work. The builders used baskets, sleds, and animals on the upper levels, and human chains below. They planned so that debris would move outward while finished rooms remained clear. They carved staircases to allow a steady flow. They understood air in practice, if not in theory, experimenting with shafts until a pull could be felt on the skin. At every stage, the city represents not only labor, but accumulated knowledge. Finally, Derinkuyu speaks to a recurring theme in human history. When danger rises, people look for protection in places that are hidden, cold, and quiet. Caves have sheltered us since before memory. What sets Derinkuyu apart is the scale of intention. This is not a cave enlarged by convenience. It is a city beneath a city, complete with worship, industry, and defense. A place where an entire population could withdraw and continue to live. In that choice lies a kind of faith. Faith that the trouble will pass. Faith that life above will resume. Faith that what is carved in darkness can preserve what is cherished in the light. The man who broke through his basement wall found only the edge of a world. The rest, as excavators have shown, stretches out in every direction beneath the modern town. Derinkuyu is a reminder that the ground we walk on can hold more history than the monuments we see. It is the first descent in our journey through the hidden architecture of human endurance, a proof that the story of civilization does not only rise upward into towers, it also sinks into the earth and waits to be found. In the green rolling country of Wiltshire, where stone cottages lean into lanes hedged with hawthorn and ash, few eyes guess what lies beneath. The hills west of London are pocked with the scars of an older industry. For centuries, masons prized the creamy blocks cut from these hills. A bath stone that built terraces and crescents, and the classical frontages that still define the city of Bath. Quarries honeycombed the ground, and in the 19th century, the tunnels grew into a lattice of galleries, large enough to swallow cathedrals. When the 20th century brought total war, and then the nuclear age, those man-made caverns offered the British state something it desperately sought. They offered depth. They offered concealment. They offered a chance to keep a government breathing when the air above might be poison. The story of Burlington begins long before anyone said the phrase civil defense. In the early years of the Second World War, the government had already seized on Wiltshire's underground spaces. Spring Quarry and Monk's Park Quarry, near the village of Corsham, were converted in haste into shadow factories for the aircraft industry. Underground rooms the size of hangars housed machine tools and assembly lines. There, protected from bombs by a roof of limestone, workers built airframes and engines for the Bristol Aeroplane Company. Trenches were cut for cables, Concrete pads poured for presses, and ventilation was coaxed through miles of stone. Men and women learned to live by a different clock. The sun never set, and the war never ended. When peace came, the tunnels did not return to silence. The state had learned a lesson. The ground could be a fortress. By the mid-1950s, the shape of the next war was obvious. The hydrogen age had dawned. American and Soviet tests raised mushroom clouds that climbed like mountains into the stratosphere. The British government confronted an arithmetic that no city could solve. A single weapon could erase a county. The planners believed that if general war came, dozens of warheads might target the United Kingdom. If the nation were to endure the first week, a functioning command had to be preserved. That meant a headquarters outside the blast rings of London, deep enough to ride out shock and fallout, and large enough to host the whole machinery of national leadership. It would need intelligence desks, map rooms, a cabinet chamber, press offices, sleeping quarters, kitchens, a hospital, water treatment, power generation, a telephone exchange that could grip the nation's trunk lines, and the means to speak to the public. The place they chose lay under Corsham. The code name chosen for it was Burlington. Burlington was not a bunker in the cinematic sense of a single chamber with a thick door. It was a city within a quarry. The site occupies roughly 35 acres underground, a statement that does not quite capture the scale. To walk its main corridors is to measure the ambition of the project. Mile after mile of passage, some broad enough for small vehicles, link blocks of offices and accommodation. The ceiling is a constant canopy of limestone, the walls a combination of rock faces and concrete cladding. Color bands run along the walls as wayfinding, and there are street names that mimic the geography above. A visitor with a good map and a poor sense of direction would still find the place disorienting. It was designed to be navigable by people who had never seen it before and who would arrive under stress. Everything in Burlington served one aim: keep a national government alive, thinking, and talking after an attack. The telephone system lies at the heart of that aim. Engineers from the General Post Office installed a vast, resilient exchange, the kind of switching brain that could route calls daylight or dark, come what may. Banks of equipment stood behind glass, humming with the light that defined the mid-century technical aesthetic. Cables ran in trays along ceilings and in trenches under floors, branching off to hundreds of wall jacks and desk phones. Burlington was meant to be a node that could anchor the national network, even if London was a crater. In lectures and memos, civil servants of the day referred again and again to continuity. That word, simple and dry, masks urgency. Without telephones, there was no command. Without command, there was no state. Next to the exchange sat the voice the public would need to hear. The planners reserved space for the British Broadcasting Corporation. In the event of an attack, the Prime Minister or a designated minister would be able to address the nation through the Wartime Broadcasting Service, a lean transmission system designed for a country under attack. The imagined script is sobering to modern ears. Citizens would be told to stay calm, to shelter, to await instructions. Many would be dead or dying, but words would still matter. In archives are plans for recorded announcements to fill the silence if the studio could not be staffed. The presence of a studio inside Burlington is a reminder that the psychological front was as real as the military front. A voice in the darkness is a form of power. Living quarters reveal the other side of continuity. Thousands of bunks were stacked in long dormitories that recalled troop ships and boarding houses. Labels on doors divided spaces by department and rank. There were small rooms set aside for the cabinet and for senior officials, and there were larger halls for clerks and messengers. Kitchens were an industrial enterprise. They could feed thousands at a time on a cycle of simple food that could be stored long and cooked fast. Ovens and boilers were coupled to a canteen plan with shifts that would make the most of limited time and space. The bakery alone could turn out hundreds of loaves daily. The hospital quarters included operating theaters, wards, a dental chair, a pharmacy, and a morgue. A water treatment plant kept the whole complex wet and clean. A laundry chugged in the background. An in-house fire brigade had its own equipment and drills. Power was the lifeblood. A bank of diesel generators sat in their own cavern, behind blast doors and acoustic baffles, with a forest of fuel tanks fed by underground lines. The engines were maintained to run at a moment's notice and to keep running for weeks. Air itself was managed like a supply. Burlington has long ventilation driftways and intake shafts that reach to the surface, fitted with filters set to trap dust and radioactive particles. There are gas-tight doors in critical places. In places where the quarried roof showed signs of weakness, reinforced concrete slabs spread the load. If the surface burned with fallout, the city underground would turn the wheels of government in a controlled island climate. In a crisis, the first question is how to get there. Burlington had answers. The village of Corsham sits just off the main line between London and the West Country. Nearby lies Box Tunnel, an engineering marvel of the Great Western Railway, driven in the age of Brunel. During the Cold War, the government maintained discreet rail arrangements to bring ministers and staff out of London in a hurry and to deliver them to the site with minimal exposure. Rumors of a concealed platform near the tunnel's ventilation shafts have swirled for years. What is certain is that road convoys could reach Corsham within a few hours, and that pre-packed files and kits sat ready to be loaded. The routes in were planned with care, and the physical entrances to the underground city were hardened and hidden among ordinary industrial buildings at the surface. The codename itself tells a small story about official secrecy and habit. Government sites of this kind received names from a list that often sounded domestic or bland. Burlington could have been an old house or a suburban station. The Central Government War Headquarters was the prosaic title used in papers with higher classification. Inside the complex, signage sometimes used the curt letters CGWHQ. There were other names attached over the years, as agencies moved in and out. The fact that so many names exist reflects how many departments and eras touched the place. An underground city that spans 50 years of planning will accumulate multiple identities. For decades, Burlington remained what it was intended to be, a secret held by a small circle of ministers, senior officials, engineers, and soldiers. Workmen who repaired cables or poured concrete in those years often did not know the whole of what they were maintaining. The Cold War has acquired an air of parody in popular memory, a world of absurd drill films and lines on classroom walls where children were taught to hide under desks. Step inside Burlington, and that irony fades. The scale of the undertaking communicates a different truth. People in power believed there might come a day when Britain faced annihilation within minutes, and they believed that the one thing worth building was a place where a government might still make decisions. The money spent below ground is the ledger of that belief. What would life have felt like for those inside if the sirens had sounded and the doors had shut? The schedule would have been relentless. A staff of perhaps 4,000 would be divided into watches. Sleep would come in short blocks. Lights would be fixed at a constant level. Time would be kept by clocks alone. Air would move in a constant faint breeze and taste faintly metallic. The same corridors would repeat the same turns. The news from the surface would come in clipped messages and broken calls. A civil service that thrives on files and conferences and routine would suddenly become a triage machine. Which roads remain passable? Which water utilities still draw? Which hospitals retain surgeons and supplies? Which regional seats of government can still function? 1,000 questions would arrive and depart in every hour, and the people in the underground city would have to transform those fragments into decisions. Even in peace, Burlington was not a museum. Periodic exercises tested the telephones and the generators. Offices were kept stocked with furniture and stationery. The maps on the walls were updated when counties changed their names and when civil defense policy shifted from one color-coded scheme to another. Engineers chased leaks, sealed cracks, and replaced fans. Fire teams practiced amid the pylons of fuel lines. The emergency food stocks were rotated. The place was expensive even when it sat empty. That is another lesson of civil defense. Insurance at this scale is never cheap. As international tension eased in the late 1980s and the 1990s brought a different vision of security, Burlington slipped from the top tier of priorities. The site had been built for a world in which a nuclear exchange was a calendar possibility. The world that emerged after the fall of the Berlin Wall still contained dangers, but they were of a kind that Burlington did not address. In 2004, the British government declassified the existence of the site. Journalists toured a few corridors. Aerial photographs of the surface buildings were published. People who had spent careers in the ministries of defense and supply told stories of the place for the first time. Even then, much remained sealed. The public saw a fraction of the city and learned that an entire town had been waiting under their feet for half a century. Declassification did not drain Burlington of interest. Historians of the modern British state found in it a case study of mid-century planning. Here was a concrete record of the way Whitehall thought about worst-case scenarios. The layout of offices reveals how different departments were expected to interact. The size of the cabinet room and the relation of the press studio to it suggests what weight communication would have carried in a crisis. The sheer number of beds for clerks and messengers says that the permanent civil service was understood to be the engine that would keep turning. Diaries of officials who participated in exercises show the human anxieties that attached to the place. Would their families be safe? Would there be any nation to govern when the doors reopened? Would the survivors above accept orders from a government that had removed itself from the blast? Those questions are not merely academic. They speak to a tension at the heart of any plan for survival. The men and women who would occupy Burlington in a war could not also protect their homes. A state that saves its files and its cabinet, but loses public consent, may survive as an organism while failing as a democratic covenant. Planners were not blind to that paradox. The wartime broadcasting service and the insistence on telling the public what was happening were meant in part to bridge the gap. There is a grim humility in the old scripts. They do not promise victory. They promise steadiness. Burlington also sits in a chain of sites that together map a British geography of secrecy. Not far away lies the complex at Rudloe Manor, once associated with the handling of classified aerial photographs and reports. Across the country, in Cheshire, the salt mine under Winsford stores government archives in controlled conditions. In the chalk under North London, the Paddock wartime cabinet rooms echoed the plan that would later be built at Corsham. The British habit of using underground space is old and resilient. Burlington is simply its grandest manifestation, the place where the idea that stone can shelter a state was pursued to its logical end. The first glimpse of Petra is a line of light. You walk for a mile through a cleft called the Seek, a sinuous corridor that nature and human hands together have shaped into a ceremonial way. The rock walls rise until the sky narrows to a blue ribbon, and the steps of your own boots are swallowed by the hush. At the final turn, a glow appears ahead, as if a lantern had been lifted in a cavern. Then the canyon opens, and a facade emerges that looks less made than revealed. Columns, pediments, and sculpted figures climb a cliff face as tall as a city hall. This is Al-Khazneh, the treasury, perhaps the most photographed doorway in the history of archaeology. To a visitor, it feels like a stage set suddenly lit. To a historian, it is a gate not only to a city, but to a way of living that joined commerce, engineering, and ritual into one of the most remarkable urban experiments of the ancient world. Petra did not begin as a display, it began as a stop. In the centuries before the Common Era, desert routes knit Arabia to the Mediterranean. Camel caravans carried incense, spices, and aromatics that were worth their weight in silver. Frankincense and myrrh traveled from the lands of the south. Bitumen and balsam moved from the Dead Sea and the Jordan Valley. From farther east came pepper and silk. The Nabateans, an Arab people whose language and script reveal a culture both pragmatic and inventive, learned to master the crossings. They were not merely middlemen. They became masters of the landscape. Their maps lived in the mind. They knew how to find water where only sand was visible. They understood how to keep a caravan alive between wells. They developed a style of politics that understood tolls and treaties as well as swords. Somewhere in that desert calculus, a rocky basin ringed by pink sandstone won their trust. Out of that basin they built Petra. The place itself is a gift of geology. The Wadi Musa Valley cuts through banks of Nubian sandstone, whose colors climb from cream to rose to rust. Flash floods carve channels that seem to change by the year. Natural caves pockmark the cliffs. The Sik, the entrance gorge, is the remnant of a fault whose split was widened by water and shaped by chisel. The Nabateans understood both the promise and the threat that such a basin offered. Water was everything. To control it was to make a city. To fail was to court disaster. The people of Petra turned the slopes and wadis into a machine. They built dams at the head of the Sik to keep floods from roaring down the entrance and sweeping travelers and guards away. They cut channels along the canyon walls and lined them with stone to carry water into the city. They fitted those channels with ceramic pipes to control the flow and to reduce loss. They cut cisterns into the rock and sealed them with plaster, then buried others beneath courtyards so that the ground itself became a reservoir. They terraced the hillsides to slow runoff and to coax small gardens from the soil. No traveler could see the hidden arteries at a glance. That was part of the plan. The lifeblood of the city moved beneath the visible. Out of that hydraulic certainty rose an urban culture that could afford to carve beauty. The treasury is only one of hundreds of facades that seem to bloom from rock. The royal tombs, a sequence of grand fronts that look down over the center, bear columned faces as tall as a modern townhouse and blend architectural vocabularies with a confidence that speaks of merchants who had seen the world. The monastery, called Ad-Dia, sits high on a western ridge and towers above a broad courtyard. its doorway could swallow a chariot. A visitor who reaches it by a long climb feels both the ambition and the endurance that the place demanded. There are temples on the floor of the city as well. The Great Temple occupies a terrace near the colonnaded street and reveals a complex plan of halls, staircases, and porticos that once framed processions and councils. Qasr al-Bint, the House of the Daughter, stands as a free-built sanctuary whose massive walls remind you that the Nabateans were not only carvers of rock faces, they could also lay courses of stone in the open and raise them high. The image that popular memory carries of Petra is the facade. It is easy to forget that behind the fronts are chambers, corridors, and stairways. For the Nabateans, the mountain itself was a building material that could be shaped inward as well as outward. Tombs were cut like houses. Some consist of a single square room with benches along the walls for the dead. Others contain multiple chambers with pilasters carved from the living rock. Many were finished with precision in the front and left rough within, as if the decorative face were part of a conversation with the city rather than a comfort for those interred. There are also rooms for the living. Rock-cut steps climb out of sight to small doorways that open onto cells where a trader could sleep or where a small family might shelter. Kitchen smoke stained the ceilings of some of these rooms. Niches held lamps. Channels in thresholds drained rainwater away. A city that looks like a sculpture garden from afar reveals itself as a hive of habitations when you move closer. The theater, carved into the slope near the center, is a lesson in Nabatean ambition filtered through Roman influence. Seating was hewn from the rock rather than built of separate blocks as at Athens or Orange. It could accommodate several thousand people and offered views that tied performance to the sacred and civic topography around it. At one edge of the city, a nymphaeum, a public fountain in a shaded corner, delivered a symbolic end to a system of pipes whose hidden head lay miles away. Water flowed into marble basins and spilled into troughs that children would have splashed in on hot afternoons. Every urban culture that plans for the public makes places where the necessities are transformed into delight. Petra did this with water. At the scale of a city block, Petra feels thoroughly Mediterranean. There is a colonnaded street. There are courtyards, baths, shops, and public squares. At the scale of a day's walk, it feels Arabian. The colors and the silence beyond the urban core, the long views and the wind, the memory of caravans resting in the shade of a cliff, all these speak of a city that would never forget the roots that created it. The art on tomb facades blends Greek and Near Eastern forms. Winged figures share space with floral scrolls and rosettes. Capitals morph from Corinthian to something that could only have been imagined here. The voices of the desert and the sea met and learned to sing a common song. Political history pressed upon the city as surely as weather. In the 1st century before the Common Era, the Nabatean kingdom emerged as a regional power with Petra as its heart. It could mint coin, sign treaties, and field armies. It maintained friendly relations with Rome when that suited and held the line when it did not. The Romans respected strength backed by income. Petra offered both. In the year 106 of the Common Era, under the Emperor Trajan, Rome annexed the Nabatean kingdom and formed the province of Arabia. The administrative center of the province lay to the north, but Petra remained an important city. The overlay of Roman urban ideals deepened. There were baths with hypercausts, formal streets, and new temples. The stones of the theater were reshaped to reflect Roman tastes. The Nabatean language did not vanish, nor did the merchants forget their skills. But the arteries of trade were changing. Desert routes lost ground to sea passages in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. As the traffic shifted away, Petra's reason for exuberance dimmed. Nature pressed in as well. Earthquakes have always written themselves into the history of the Levant. In the year 363, a severe tremor shook Petra and the neighboring cities. Masonry work suffered, and some of the rock-cut facades shed cornices and figures. Repairs were made. Life went on. Over the following centuries, other quakes followed. There were years when drought bit hard. There were years when the old dams and channels successfully tempered the blows, and years when the floods overran the protections and cut the Sikh as if with a new blade. In the 7th century, the rise of new polities and the redirection of commerce sealed a long decline. Petra was not empty. A monastery sheltered monks. Local families maintained small plots. Crusaders later built a small fort at a vantage point above the city, and then they moved on. In the end, the place was known mostly to the people of the nearby village and to the Bedouin who used some of the ancient caves. In the 19th century, a Swiss traveler named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt learned to pass as an Arab in order to explore lands closed to European curiosity. In the year 1812, he gained the trust of local guides by claiming a wish to sacrifice at the tomb of Aaron, the brother of Moses, whose shrine lies on a high peak near Petra. He entered the Sikh with an escort and came upon the treasury with a controlled expression. He had learned not to show excitement. In his diary, he recorded what he saw with spare wonder. He could not linger for fear of arousing suspicion. He left with a sketch in his mind of a lost city in the rocks. News of the find filtered back to a Europe already enamored with the romantic ruins of Greece and Egypt. In time, travelers came with notebooks and watercolors. Scholars arrived with measuring tapes. Later still, archaeologists began to peel away the sand and the gravel that centuries had laid down and that sudden storms had swept into courtyards. The work of excavation has revealed a city that is both more ordinary and more surprising than legend. On the one hand, Petra contains bakeries, shops, workyards, and homes that remind us that cities are places where people grind, grain, and argue and fall in love. On the other hand, the engineering of its water system continues to impress students of ancient technology. Along the Sikh, one can trace channels carved into the cliffs at 2 levels. The upper channels carried water from distant springs. At some points, these channels are covered by rock slabs so that sunlight would not encourage the growth of algae and so that evaporation would be slowed. Where the canyon walls widened, the Nabateans fitted in clay pipes, their ends joined like beads in a string. Cisterns are found not only in the obvious spots but in subtle hollows dressed with plaster. The system could be tuned by opening and closing sluices so that an overflow ran harmlessly into a side valley. Scholars have argued that the reliability of water in Petra was as much a political instrument as a technical achievement. A people who can promise water when their neighbors cannot will always be a power. If much has been revealed, much remains buried. Wind and gravity have spent 2,000 years pulling sediment down the slopes and into the city. Flood events can lay down a surprising depth of debris in a single night. Modern archaeologists sometimes find that the floor they assumed was the ancient walking level sits several feet above the level a Nabatean would have known. Test trenches cut in plazas and beside walls have brought to light staircases that vanish into fill and doorways that seem to sink. Ground-penetrating radar and resistivity surveys hint at voids under courtyards and steps, suggesting that rooms and tunnels still wait. It is a reminder that an ancient city is not a finished book. It is a palimpsest, where each generation writes a bit, erases a bit, and leaves the text for the next reader. The buried Petra is not only a matter of unexcavated rooms. The city also contains intentional underground spaces that were part of its life. Beneath the Great Temple, archaeologists discovered a lower level with vaulted rooms, a space of columns and doorways that would have been hidden from a casual visitor above. The meaning of this cellar world is still debated. It may have been a service level that supported rituals above. It may have carried its own ceremonies, a shadow reflection of the public space overhead. In other parts of the city, small tunnels and culverts accompany the water system and testify to a habit of building below ground in order to keep the surface free for processions. In the Sikh itself, behind the channel that carries water, a second channel runs that seems to have been a drainage line for waste. The city kept its necessary filth out of sight and out of smell. There is also an underworld of belief. Petra contains high places where altars look out over the city, and it contains low places where sanctuaries withdraw into the rock. The god most often associated with Petra is Dushara, a lord of the mountains. Shrines contained stone blocks that represented divinity. Some inscriptions invoke other deities from neighboring cultures, a natural result of a city that saw merchants arrive from Egypt, Syria, and the great caravan towns of the East. Temples and tombs share space because in a world where trade risked life and where water was a daily preoccupation, the lines between sacred and practical were not as sharp as modern minds draw them. A tomb facade could be a monument to wealth and to piety at once. A dining room cut behind a facade could host both a funeral meal and a civic dinner. Roman rule did not extinguish the city's native character. Women are visible in inscriptions as donors and patrons. Local elites maintained estates and gave back to the city through building. Craftsmen continued to carve in a style that kept the sharp geometry of Nabatean taste even when copying a Roman figure. Greek was written on some walls, but Nabatean Aramaic persisted in others. Coins bear witness to a city that still marked its own rhythms, even as imperial governors came and went. The long view of Petra teaches that cultures can be absorbed politically, yet retain their self-understanding for generations. The archaeology of Petra has always had to grapple with a living community. The people of the Wadi Musa region are not artifacts. In the 19th and 20th centuries, some families made their homes within the ancient caves. Children were born in rooms that a Nabatean had cut. Herds were kept in rock-cut stables. Modern tourism brought both wealth and dislocation. In recent decades, the government of Jordan has sought to balance preservation with livelihood by relocating families to new houses, regulating access, and curating routes that keep the most fragile areas from being trampled to dust. Conservation scientists now work beside engineers to stabilize facades whose sandstone has been weakened by salts. They study how wind and water eat at cornices and how to restore a dam without erasing the ancient lines of its masonry. Every gain in understanding comes with a responsibility to keep the place from being loved to death. The image of the treasury still dominates the way the world thinks of Petra, but a historian who lingers gains a different vocabulary. The words that come to mind are network, adaptation, and memory. Petra is a network of routes above and below ground. It adapted technologies from many lands and made them its own. It preserves in its stone a memory of a people who learned to stand at the edge of desert and mountain and make that edge their center. The underground at Petra is not a realm of monsters or myth. It is an infrastructure. It is a practical wonder. It is the city's secret strength. There is an old line that says the ruins of a city are the shell after the mind has flown. Petra suggests a different thought. In this place, the mind was directed inward, into the rock and into the channels that run beneath the streets. The city grew by subtraction, by removing stone to reveal space, and by hiding away the systems that made life possible. The grandeur that lifts a tourist's heart was never separate from the drains and cisterns that lay out of sight. If we tell the story of Petra only through its facades, we tell half a story. The full tale includes the men who climbed into narrow conduits to plaster a leak, and the women who calculated how many jars could be filled for a journey. It includes children who learned to read letters on tomb fronts and who learned to read the sky for weather. It includes priests who carried images up stairways, to altars on cliffs, and officials who carried tablets into offices shaded from the Sunday. When the lights fade and the last visitor leaves the basin, the rock turns the colors of embers. Swifts dance above the theater. The wind comes down the Seek as if the canyon itself were breathing. In that hush, one can imagine the city when it lived. Laughter from a courtyard leaks into a lane. A caravan bells through the dusk. A guardian checks the dam and listens to the water move in the channel beyond the wall. Somewhere, a mason draws a line on a slab that will become a lintel. Somewhere, a family lights a small lamp in a room cut by an ancestor. The city above ground and the city below meet in that flame. Arriving at Orvieto, one first sees the cliff. It rises abruptly from the Umbrian plain, like a ship cut from stone, its walls shining pale gold in the Sunday. Cypress trees ring the base and vineyards pattern the fields beyond. The town itself crowns the top of the bluff and seems suspended above the valleys, so perfectly perched that it could be a stage set. The traveler admires the cathedral with its banded marble and a facade where saints and prophets glow like embers in late afternoon light. That is the public face of Orvieto. There is another face. It lies in darkness. For beneath the tiled roofs and cobbled lanes stretches a second city cut into the volcanic rock. This unseen Orvieto is older than the medieval frescoes, and at times more honest. It tells how people here learned to live with siege and drought, with the demands of trade and the fear of sudden invasion. It is the story of a community that went underground and kept going for centuries. The geology writes the prologue. Orvieto stands on a mesa of volcanic tuff, the compacted ash of ancient eruptions that blanketed central Italy long before cities were raised. Tuff is a generous stone. It yields to a hand tool with a predictable bite. It is light in weight, yet strong enough to hold an arch if the carver respects the grain. The Etruscans understood this gift as well as any people could. They settled this promontory at least by the 6th century before the Common Era and named the place Velsna, the city that later Latin speakers would call Volsinii. From the start, they carved. They cut wells straight down to find water. They carved cisterns to hold it. They hollowed rooms for storage so that grain and oil could be kept cool and safe. In death, they went to the rock as well. On the slopes below the town run lines of tombs where families housed their dead in chambers, dressed like houses, with benches, columns, and carved beams of stone. The living city sat upon a platform that was itself a hive of human labor. War shaped the first great transformation of Orvieto. In the 3rd century, before the Common Era, the Roman Republic pushed north and west through Etruscan lands. After a long struggle, Volsinii fell. Rome removed many inhabitants to a different site near the shores of Lake Bolsena and called that colony the New Volsinii. The old city on the rock did not die. Its strategic position and its water made it a prize again in late antiquity and the early medieval period. In those centuries, both petty wars and grand campaigns moved through the peninsula. The Lombards came and stayed. Power fractured and reassembled. A town above an easily fortified escarpment offered safety. That safety, however, was never unconditional. In a siege, the first question is water. The Orvietani therefore returned to cutting. They extended ancient cisterns, linked them by galleries, and tunneled toward the sheer outer walls, where they could open discreet vents and draw air through the maze. They learned to interlock chambers so that the collapse of one would not bring a chain of disaster. In this, they followed instincts that had guided the Etruscans. They did so at a far greater scale. Over centuries, the underground grew into a second topography. Modern mapping suggests that more than 1,200 caves, galleries, and passageways perforate the ridge. The distribution is not random. Under the oldest quarters, you find the densest honeycomb, a pattern that mirrors the earliest urban core. Many caves begin as simple rectangular rooms that a family might have dug for storage. With time, the room would be extended to hold jars of wine and oil, or cut further to connect with an older neighbor. Over generations, a private cellar became a tunnel complex, and in some cases, a tunnel complex became a small district below ground, with multiple rooms and crossways. Some of these rooms contain the carved sockets where olive press beams were anchored. In others, circular pits cut into the floor once held the wooden baskets used for pressing, or later the wide ceramic jars for must and oil. The tough's even temperature made these chambers valuable for wine. In an age before thermometers, people knew that a good cellar could be the difference between abundance and famine. One of the most distinctive features of Orvieto's underground is the dovecote room. You enter a chamber whose walls are pocked with hundreds of square niches, neat as a chessboard. Each little bay once housed a pigeon. These birds were an important part of the local economy. They provided meat in lean seasons, and their droppings fertilized terraced gardens on the slopes. The square format made it easy to clean and to collect, and the bird could be plucked from its niche when needed. Dovecotes appear in many Mediterranean landscapes, but Orvieto's underground variety is a local signature. To stand in such a room is to feel the intimacy of subsistence. It is also to understand that the city below was not only defensive, it was productive. The underground's role in crisis is nevertheless clear. When violence threatened, the people of Orvieto took shelter in the caves. Medieval chronicles recall raids by roaming bands and disputes among rival communes that could turn streets into barricades. The caves served as bolt holes and refuges. Narrow entrances could be disguised with a door cut to sit flush with a house floor. A family might lower a plank and descend out of sight as soldiers hammered at the front gate. Fires lit below ground smoked through chimneys that had been cut to emerge beneath rooftops, where the curling plume looked like any other hearth. The enemy saw nothing that betrayed a cluster of families gathered in the dark only a few rooms away. In later centuries, the pattern repeated. During the Second World War, when Allied bombers ranged across the peninsula and German planes answered, Orvieto's caves opened again. Families descended with blankets and a lamp. Children learned to wait out raids in silence while the walls breathed cool air. The engineering that connected this labyrinth to the life above reached its culmination with the most famous work of Orvieto's subterranean art, the Well of St. Patrick. In the year 1527, Pope Clement VII fled to Orvieto after the sack of Rome. The city was safe because it sat on a rock. It was not safe from thirst. Clement ordered a deep well that could supply water in any siege. The architect Antonio da Sangallo the Younger designed a solution that is still studied today. He sank a shaft into the tuff to reach the water table and lined it with masonry. Then he wrapped two helical staircases around the cylindrical wall. Each spiral is isolated from the other and lit by small windows that pierce the thickness and admit a ribbon of daylight. Mules could carry empty buckets down one staircase to the water and climb the other with full loads, without ever having to turn or collide. The device is as elegant as a clock. The depth of the well is a subject of local pride. It reaches down scores of meters to floating lanterns that look like stars. Visitors who descend and ascend understand in their legs how important water was to Orvieto and how serious its leaders were about securing it. The well is often cited for its beauty and inventive spirit, but it is part of a larger pattern of hydraulic intelligence that runs across Orvieto's history. Channels cut into the tuff carry rainwater to underground cisterns. In some courtyards, round mouths of stone mark the entrance to these cisterns. The walls inside are plastered with a waterproof coating whose recipe came down through craft guilds. The underground chambers beneath workshops and kitchens have sumps where wastewater pooled before it was directed out through drains cut to daylight on the cliff face. As the town grew on the surface, the underground mitigated the strain. When a family opened a grocery on a narrow lane, it cut a cool cellar below where cheeses could age and wine could rest. When a potter needed a steady place to fire vessels, a cave made a kiln where temperature could be controlled and drafts were predictable. Daily life in the underground has left thousands of traces that humanize the grand story. Lamp niches dot the walls at shoulder height, their small shelves blackened with soot. In some rooms, faint graffiti lines hint at names and dates. Wooden beams, long decayed, have left the ghost of their seats in the rock. Animal tether rings remain in stables carved into the upper levels where air was better. Many rooms are stepped so that one can move from a high vestibule down to a lower working floor without stooping. In olive-pressing caves, the floor is often ribbed to allow spilled oil to drain toward a collection point. In dovecotes, the lowest rows of niches are sometimes more worn than the highest, the trace of generations of hands reaching to lift plump birds from the first tier. The underground is a living archive of touch. The medieval and Renaissance periods layered another kind of story onto these rock-cut forms. Orvieto became a papal stronghold more than once. Popes and cardinals retreated here to escape danger in Rome and to negotiate alliances. The town sat astride routes linking the north and the south. Its markets brought Umbrian wool and wine into contact with the goods of Tuscany and Lazio. Such prominence brought conflict. The feuds of Guelph and Ghibelline played out on the ridge as they did throughout central Italy. Noble families fortified towers and squared palaces. Those towers often rose from foundations that concealed stair shafts into caves below. Leaning close to cellar walls, one can sometimes find blocked doors that once allowed a swift retreat to the base of the cliff and out to a path only locals knew. The city learned to keep its escape hatches to itself. In the 19th and 20th centuries, attention turned from living in the caves to understanding them. Landslides along the cliff face exposed collapses that prompted the city to study what lay beneath its streets. Speleologists and historians began to map the voids with measuring tapes and string lines, then with more sophisticated instruments. They found that rumors were often precise. A baker who claimed a tunnel stretched from his grandfather's cellar to a cistern 2 streets away was sometimes exactly right. Much of the network was private property, parceled in the same way the buildings above were parceled. Families held keys to small doors in their kitchens that led to staircases into rooms their ancestors had cut. As a municipal project of conservation took shape in the later 20th century, the city negotiated access to representative caves and stabilized them for guided tours. The public could at last see the dovecotes, the presses, and the interlocking rooms that had been the lifeblood of the underground for so long. Scholars still debate the precise chronology for many parts of the maze. A niche or a stair gives few clues without an inscription or a piece of pottery in situ. Stratigraphy is difficult in a space that has been cleaned and reused by many hands. Yet broad patterns hold. The oldest works belong to the Etruscan period and include wells, cisterns, and passages that move in clean, straight lines toward practical goals. Later work shows a medieval taste for rooms that nest together and for passages that seek alternative routes to the same destination. The Renaissance adds arches and occasionally carved moldings that introduce an air of domestic grace to what would otherwise be a plain cellar. The 20th century appears in concrete patches and brick lintels used to shore a portal or brace a wall where old stone had failed. In this way, one can read Orvieto's Underground as a continuous collaborative building that never ceased to be edited. There is a temptation to romanticize the darkness. It must be resisted. Life in the caves could be harsh, air can go stale, light is a constant concern. To open a door to the surface increases risk. In summer, the cool air below feels like a blessing, but in winter, the damp can ache in bones. The presence of animals in the upper chambers leaves a smell that no vent entirely dispels. Yet it is precisely the refusal to romanticize that allows one to see the achievement for what it is. The people of Orvieto invested untold hours in cutting and maintaining a safety net that they hoped they would rarely need. They made their food storage more reliable. They created a system of redundancy for water. They made places to hide when fighting swept the streets. They did this not with grand theories, but with chisels, plumb lines, and an intimate knowledge of the rock. The result is a second city that could take a shock and allow the first city to continue. Above this world rises a structure that shines on postcards and travel posters. The Cathedral of Orvieto is a masterpiece of Italian Gothic, with a facade embroidered in stone and glass that no visitor forgets. It might seem a different universe from the caves. The truth is that the same mind shaped both. The Duomo honors a miracle of blood that was said to have stained a priest's cloth. Faith called artisans to build a house for that relic. The city below protected the people who would come and kneel before it. The artist who carved a prophet on the west front and the mason who carved a staircase in a cellar both served a common community. In both cases, patience and skill built endurance into a fragile place. In modern Orvieto, the underground has become a subject of careful stewardship. Engineers monitor the stability of the cliff. Archaeologists document features before any work is done in a building above. Guides explain how a dovecote worked and why a press had that particular shape. The city has embraced the idea that its identity is doubled. The wine poured in a restaurant has likely matured in a cave. The olive oil on the table remembers an older press. The stories told to children in bedtime whispers often feature the time when a great-grandparent took shelter underground while bombs fell far away. Memory binds the lanes on top to the chambers below in a way that no museum label alone could do. Every city has layers. Orvieto's layers are unusually literal. The tourist leaves the piazza, turns down an alley, and descends a few steps. The air changes. The eye adjusts. Walls glow with a faint amber that comes only from stone. A guide raises a small lamp and points to a row of niches where pigeons once slept. In the next room stands the square base, where a press beam once turned under weary hands at harvest. In the third, a small opening leads to a tunnel that disappears into darkness, with a curve that says it will meet a door in a house 2 streets north. It is a living lesson in how people build not only up toward the sky, but also down toward the steady heart of the earth. Orvieto teaches other lessons as well. It shows that resilience is a craft and not a slogan. It shows that prosperity rests on countless quiet decisions made in cellars over centuries. It shows that beauty on a facade is supported by slow work in places no visitor thinks to look. It shows that a city can carry two lives at once and stay whole. The sunlit Piazza del Duomo and the lamp-lit chamber beneath a shop are part of one story. The story of a people who learned to trust stone in two directions. The first thing to understand about the Chinese tradition of going to ground is that it is old. Fortified cave villages punctuate the lowest terraces of the northwest. Mountain temples disappear into cliff faces cut by quiet chisels 1,000 years ago. Bandit kings hid their retinues in labyrinths threaded through limestone hills. When modern China set about protecting its most destructive secrets, it reached instinctively for stone. A nation that endured invasion and civil war. A nation that watched nuclear fire bloom on test ranges in distant deserts, learned a lesson that the ancients already knew. Depth is a kind of power. Distance can be measured downward as well as across the map. In that logic was born the immense network that Chinese officers began to call the underground Great Wall. The story begins in the early years of the nuclear age and reaches its first full expression in the middle of the 20th century. In the 1950s, Chinese scientists, with assistance from Soviet advisors at first and then alone, pursued the physics and engineering that would produce an atomic weapon. A blast at Lop-Ner in 1964 announced success. A thermonuclear test followed 3 years later. A strategic force needs more than warheads. It needs the means to deliver them and to keep them alive when rivals prepare to strike first. The Chinese leadership formed a new branch to tend that force. It was known as the Second Artillery, a name that sounds modest and old-fashioned only at first hearing. Behind that title grew an organization whose job was to move missiles, protect them, and keep a thin thread of command intact through the first hours of a war that the world hoped would never happen. The geography of China shaped that mission. The country stretches from the damp coasts of the east to the deserts and mountains of the far west. The land holds granite ranges, soft loess that crumbles under a strong wind, karst zones riddled with caves, and basins where clay bakes into hardpack in summer and splits in winter. Somewhere within that variety, the Second Artillery learned how to bury steel and wire and fuel in a way that would make sense to soldiers and engineers under pressure. What emerged from decades of practice and construction was a system of tunnels and caverns measured in thousands of kilometers. The figures that circulate in public reports vary. Some speak of 3,000 miles of tunnel, others of 5,000 kilometers. What matters more than the precise count is the intent made visible in concrete and rock. The intent was to hide a forest of missiles and to let them move, to hide command posts and let them speak, to hide fuel and spares and let them flow, and to do this under the eyes of rivals and satellites. The heart of the underground Great Wall rests in mountain belts in the north and center of the country. The Taihang Range and neighboring ridges run like a spine behind the coastal plains. Here, builders drove adits into sheer faces and turned valleys into cul-de-sacs, with gates of steel painted the color of stone. The doors open to roads that disappear into the mountain and then branch like a river delta, some galleries broad and high enough to admit full-sized transporter vehicles. Other tunnels narrow and slip off to storage caverns stacked with crates and drums. A visitor who expected mud and rough work would find instead the discipline of military construction. Pavements are poured smooth to speed heavy tires. Drainage gutters run along the edges to keep winter ice from forming where a driver could lose control. Ventilation trunks rise to scattered chimneys on the slopes above, each capped and camouflaged, each fitted with shutters that can be closed if poison rides the wind. Power catenaries and communications lines run in protected ducts. Wayfinding is reduced to colors and numbers so that a new crew can find its route without asking questions. This is not a single tunnel. It is a world inside the mountain. Outside the mountain, the network blends into the landscape. Dirt roads enter low concrete sheds that look like barns to a casual glance and lead to ramps obscured by brush. In some places, tunnels open into walled yards where buildings suggest an ordinary depot. A satellite photograph might see a motor pool. Only a trained eye would notice that tire marks do not return by the same gate and that the walls are positions for security crews rather than simple fences. Along rail lines, spurs vanish under slopes covered with scrub and reappear miles away, a sign that some galleries can take a locomotive and several cars. The basic principle is to turn the approach to any strategic asset into a riddle. If an enemy cannot tell which door leads to a live missile and which to an empty decoy, then the enemy must aim at all the doors. If a road has 7 possible exits, a patrol can choose the 8th by using a gallery that was not visible from above. That is how survivability is built with concrete rather than with a promise. There is also a geology to concealment that the Chinese network uses with care. Granite holds a vault better than crumbly sediment, but cracks under certain stresses. Limestone gives dry air in winter, but can be betrayed by water if drainage is slack. Loess yields easily to a pick, but collapses without reinforcement. In the Taihang and other granite zones, builders cut deep and used rock bolts and sprayed concrete to hold the crown. In karst country, they learned the map of invisible water. In soft country, they added ribs and beams in the way a miner would, then lined the finished room to keep dust down and air stable. That technique is not glamorous. It is the work of crews who learn from collapse as often as from success, and who keep notebooks that mix soil descriptions with thumb-ruled calculations for span and load. Out of that dull craft grew galleries that can carry heavy vehicles to the edge of a launch pad and then absorb the shock of a blast without shattering. The proof that tunnels are not an ornament lies in the operational rhythm they enable. A transporter can leave a garrison under cover, roll for hours through the mountain, emerge through a different door, fuel quickly from a line fed by tanks hidden behind another ridge, set up a launch in a small valley that looks like a farmer's pasture, and then retreat while a decoy vehicle takes its place. A launch crew needs to believe that this sequence will work in the worst hour of their lives. Every detail that keeps that belief alive becomes policy. The entrances are repainted after every monsoon. The road surface is patched before a pothole can grow. The drainage grates are cleared by men with sticks after every storm. Camouflage nets are tested against new satellite cameras. Signs warn against stray cigarette ash near fuel lines. In that sense, the underground Great Wall is as much a habit as a place. It is a discipline of maintenance that turns a map of tunnels into a living machine. The secrecy that guards the machine produces its own history. In the early 2000s, a wave of public reporting in foreign capitals drew attention to the scale of the Chinese network. Analysts cited figures for total length and pointed to brigades that had relocated to base areas with new galleries. Some stories used dramatic language that compared the tunnels to the ancient wall along the northern frontier. Chinese state media, which can be both coy and proud in the same breath, allowed glimpses of soldiers in hard hats riding trucks through clean-cut adits decorated with slogans about training and loyalty. Retired officers described life under the mountain in phrases that blended tedium and resolve. Western scholars argued over the numbers, and whether the tunnels concealed a far larger stockpile of weapons than outside estimates had supposed. A few argued that the grand scale of the tunnels might hide a force sized more modestly, a chess player bluffing with an imposing board. What emerges from that debate is not a final count, but an appreciation for a doctrine. If a country wants to make sure that some missiles will survive a first strike, it can harden a few silos and hope, or it can build a maze and refuse to tell a rival which corners matter most. The Chinese did not invent the idea. The United States and the Soviet Union both invested heavily in hardened shelters and underground command posts. North Korea later carved shelter systems into hills along its coasts and borders. Iran constructed tunnels for the same reasons of survival and misdirection. Yet the Chinese project stands out for its territorial scale and for the way it adapts older habits of living with stone to modern needs. The mountains of the north have been dug for centuries for coal and iron. Farmers in Shaanxi and Shaanxi live in cave homes that soften the extremes of winter and summer. Builders of temples long ago understood how to set a stair inside a cliff in such a way that a pilgrim feels the mountain itself bowing toward the altar. The underground Great Wall is an inheritance updated with diesel fuel and fiber optics. Underground space in China is not only for rockets. In the southwest, in a bend of the Yangtze near Fuling, a different Cold War project created a city within a hill for an entirely separate purpose. It is known publicly today as Project 816, an immense cavern complex cut to house a plutonium production plant should the coast be threatened. The plant never produced war material and now serves as a cautionary museum of the scale at which the era thought and built. Its vaulted galleries, rail spurs, and control rooms echo with the same lessons found in military tunnels farther north. When a state decides that stone is a better ally than air, it moves below and stays there until the threat passes. Along the southeastern coast, underground fuel depots still feed fleets and airports through pipes that enter mountains like roots entering soil. In some inland cities, civil defense shelters now serve as storage or have been converted at times into underground malls or car parks. These side stories matter because they show how a habit of carving space below ground migrates easily from one function to another. The strategic and the civilian overlap like strata in a cut bank. The people who make a living inside this world of rock form a culture of their own. They are drivers who know which turn will ice first in January. They are signalmen who can string a line through a gallery without leaving slack for a passing truck to catch. They are plumbers for whom a valve jam at 3 in the morning is as important as a battle plan. They are electricians who can light a kilometer of tunnel with a spare crate of bulbs when a shipment is late. They are cooks who can feed a crew through a week of exercises when no one is allowed to leave, and who can invent recipes that please soldiers who have slept on bunks beside concrete walls. They are medics who understand that an injury underground has a different set of risks than an injury in an open field. They are officers who repeat the same checks through the same doors with the same patience that their predecessors used when a different premier gave orders from a different building far away. The underground Great Wall is a place, but it is also a profession. There is a romance to the image of a rocket disappearing into a mountain and then emerging only when the nation needs it. The reality is more prosaic and, in an odd way, more impressive. A launcher is a complicated machine that breaks if it is not exercised. Fuel ages, rubber dries. Electronics get temperamental if they sit too long without a trained hand to coax them. Tunnel networks answer those facts by letting crews practice in weather that would paralyze an open range. A blizzard that closes a highway will not stop a run through a mountain road that is sheltered from the wind. A sandstorm that blinds a surveillance satellite will not interrupt a drill inside a cavern lit by fluorescent tubes. In this way, the underground is a training ground as much as it is a shelter. The crew that learns to back a tractor through a tight bend in a dim gallery will do better on a mountain pass when nerves matter. Much of what has been built is intended never to be used in anger. That paradox sits at the center of all nuclear strategy. A force that can survive a first blow and answer with a second gives pause to an attacker who does not want to invite ruin in return. The more certain that pause, the less likely the first blow. The underground Great Wall is a device for instilling that pause. It says to any rival that weapons are hidden in places a bomber cannot strip clean, and in numbers, a planner cannot count with confidence. It says that even if an enemy were to take out a set of known silos and field bases, there would still be caves full of trucks that can find their way to light. It is a grim reassurance. It is also the foundation of the uneasy peace that has held since the first bombs were built. The Chinese network has evolved with technology. Early generations of missiles were liquid-fueled and demanded careful and time-consuming preparation that made mobility a slow ballet. Later generations went to solid fuel that can be stored and moved with greater ease. Guidance improved. Communications became robust enough to survive attacks on some nodes without severing the chain. The tunnels had to change in turn. Some galleries that once handled smaller vehicles were widened. New branches were cut to reach new dispersal areas. Old storage rooms were sealed, turned into decoys, or converted to different uses. A network that was static would have betrayed itself. A network that adjusts is harder to map and harder to kill. This underground story also has a home front that is not about the military at all. In the 1960s and 1970s, during moments of acute fear of invasion or nuclear exchange, some cities dug extensive civil defense shelters. Beijing developed an entire parallel world of hand-cut corridors beneath its urban core, fitted in places with schools, clinics, and modest shops. Other cities did the same on a lesser scale. While the civil defense projects have their own chapter in the history of underground China, they share a premise with the military galleries in the hills. When a society expects that fire may fall from the sky, it looks to the earth for refuge. The state encouraged that impulse and offered tools and plans. The result is an architectural imagination that runs in two directions at once. It builds towers that impress. It also builds burrows that endure. Foreign writers sometimes treat the underground Great Wall as a single thing that one can photograph and comprehend in a visit. The better metaphor is a family of systems that share an ancestry. In one base area, a brigade built galleries with a preference for straight cuts and right angles because the rock permitted it and the contractors had that habit. In another base area, the same mission produced winding routes and chambers set at odd angles because the geology demanded it, or the local engineers used mining crews with different skills. Some entrances look like little villas with tidy fences. Others look like scars on a cliff. You can tell the age of a corridor by the color and texture of its lining. A gallery poured in the 1980s reflects a different concrete recipe than one sprayed in the early 2000s. The markings on the walls give away eras of signage and doctrine. In that sense, a walk through a single tunnel can feel like a walk through time. For the historian, perhaps the most intriguing feature of this subterranean landscape is how it reorders the map of power. We tend to think of coastlines and capitals as the natural places where a state fixes its attention. The underground Great Wall quietly moves focus inland and beneath. The valleys and ridges that farmers knew as pasture and rock face become strategic spaces. A rural county with few industries becomes the keeper of a national deterrent. The night shift in a mountain base cradles decisions that could outweigh the orders signed in an office tower by a river. A soldier who checks the pressure on a fuel line at 3 in the morning is part of a chain that runs through doctrine, budget, diplomacy, and fear. The work is humble. The stakes are vast. It is tempting to end with abstractions about deterrence and stability, but the underground is also a human environment, and it pays to return to what the senses report. The air is cooler and smells of concrete dust. Trucks rumble like distant thunder down a branch line. Somewhere near the ceiling, a fan hums with a rhythm that you begin to notice only when it stops for a maintenance check, and the quiet swells into your ears. A driver switches off a headlamp, and the darkness is complete. A cave black that city dwellers rarely meet. A minute later, the lamp goes on, and the world snaps back into being, with yellow lines on the floor and a painted arrow pointing toward a door that blends into the wall until it moves. You look at that door and think about what a mountain can hide. The old wall of China was built to be seen. The underground Great Wall is built to be guessed at. It is visible only in pieces, in narrow photographs, and in the stories of those who worked inside. It was made by crews whose names will never appear on plaques. It is a triumph not of spectacle but of patience. It is the most modern expression of a very old belief. When trouble comes from the sky, the earth will keep you if you know how to ask. Stand on the high mazes of the southwest at dusk, and the land looks like an ocean of stone. Plateaus rise like islands, canyons run like drowned rivers, and at the horizon, mountains float like dark ships. In this vast and spare landscape, stories run as deep as the rock. Many of the continent's first peoples carry memories of a world below the surface, a realm of chambers, caves, and passages where their ancestors waited out disaster or took shape in the first days of the world. These are not simply folk tales told to pass a winter evening. They are cosmologies and maps. They explain where a people came from, how they should live, and how the ground beneath them is alive with doors that open between worlds. The best known of these traditions belongs to the Hopi, whose mesas stand on the southern edge of the Colorado Plateau. In the Hopi language, there is a word for a small, round opening cut in the floor of a ceremonial chamber. It is called the Sipapuni, often shortened to Sipapu. At first glance, it is only a neat hole rimmed in stone. In Hopi, teaching it is the place of emergence. The people once lived below, in a previous world that had grown out of balance. Divine beings known in English as the Friends, often called the Ant People in popular retellings, led the Hopi ancestors into caverns where they survived a period of catastrophe. When the time of renewal came, the people climbed toward the light. The Sipapu is a symbol of that passage. Every kiva, the round or square chamber used for ritual gatherings, contains one. The act of entering a kiva by a ladder and descending into a room that is partly underground restages the history of emergence in the present. The people do not visit a museum, they visit their origin. This story is often told with a confidence that surprises listeners raised on myth as entertainment. For the Hopi, it is not a metaphor that can be traded for a new image next season. It is a truth that orders their relation to the land and to the seasons. Ceremonies mark the turning points of the year and the arrival of the rains. The village is arranged so that life unfolds around the kivas. The Sipapu and the ladder remind everyone that there is a world below which is neither dead nor distant. The rock is a living thing, full of memory and presence. A historian cannot test such a claim with picks and notebooks. What one can do is walk the mesas and see how completely the architecture of daily life and of ceremony is shaped by a conviction that the ground is a partner rather than a platform. To the east and south, other Pueblo peoples tell stories that rhyme with the Hopi account. The Zuni speak of coming into this world from an earlier one, guided by divine twins. The Acoma hold Mount Taylor as a place of sacred power that anchors their story of emergence, and their homeland contains lava flows whose caves served as water stores and seasonal shelters. Farther north, in the land of the Diné, the Navajo tell of a passage through earlier worlds, each abandoned when its order failed. Their fifth world is this one. Holy people taught the rules that sustain it, among them the rituals that belong to a Hogan, the traditional house that is itself an image of the cosmos. In these traditions, underground is not only a place of refuge, it is a layer of reality that touches the present. The earth is stratified with meaning. When a person steps down a ladder into a ceremonial room, that person is not going backward, but inward, toward the beginning. If the Southwest gives us the clearest architectural expression of this cosmology, other regions of North America also bind identity to caves and to the underworld. On the northern plains, the Lakota tell a story of emergence at a place that can be visited today. Wind Cave lies in the Black Hills, a range the Lakota call Paha Sapa, the heart of the world. The cave mouth is modest, a crack in the rock that breathes when pressure changes across the prairie. Yet, out of that fissure, the Lakota say the people came, guided by the trickster and teacher Iktomai, or by the Buffalo Nation in some tellings. When the United States seized the Black Hills after the discovery of gold, the taking was not only a matter of land and treaties, it was a violation of a sacred geography. To stand at the cave opening with a Lakota elder is to see how the word homeland can mean something deeper than a zone drawn on a survey map. The entrance to the underworld is a door in a house that is still lived in. Along the Ozark Plateau, into the Appalachians, and west to the Great Basin, caves have long served as places of shelter, as storehouses, and as sites of ceremony. Archaeology records their use in a very practical register. Torch marks striped limestone ceilings, where miners, in late archaic centuries, scraped gypsum and mineral salts for medicine and ritual. Footprints survive in places where a fine powder covered the floor and the air was still. In Mammoth Cave and neighboring systems in Kentucky, explorers have followed the smoky signatures of cane torches along miles of passages. Fragile sandals and woven bags have been recovered from dry cave chambers in the Great Basin, reminders that people lived and worked underground when the light and the season made it wise. These finds are not distant from the stories of emergence. They do not prove the stories in a scientific sense. They do show how easily a culture that values the underworld in a spiritual vocabulary learns to use it in a practical one. Some tales turn darker. In the Great Basin, the northern Paiute tell of an enemy people called Site-Ka, often translated as tool eaters, because they wove boats and goods from the reeds of lakes and marshes. In 19th century retellings by settlers, the Site-Ka became cannibals and giants. The most famous version places a final battle at the entrance to what is now called Lovelock Cave in Nevada. The Paiute say their ancestors trapped the Site-Ka inside and set a fire at the mouth. When archaeologists excavated the cave in the early 20th century, they found a layered record of ordinary life that stretched back thousands of years. The most celebrated discovery was a cache of Tule duck decoys, handsome and clever, about 2,000 years old. There were also baskets, nets, and human coprolites that allowed later researchers to identify what people had eaten. No evidence of giants was found. The story had traveled through too many mouths and had been inflected by settlers who loved to marvel. Yet even in this case, the kernel of the narrative endures. A cave served as a stronghold. The entrance became a theater of desperation and war. The community remembered that a dangerous people lived below, and that the way to win was to control the door. The shape of a ceremonial room gives us a method to think with. Consider the kiva, which appears in many forms across the ancient and living Pueblo world. In Chaco Canyon, in New Mexico, great houses built 1,000 years ago framed plazas with suites of kivas, some small and family-sized, others large enough to hold a significant gathering. Each kiva carries a vocabulary of features. The sipapu sits in the floor toward the east, a mouth to the underworld. A bench or banquette runs along the wall. Roof beams rest on pilasters and are covered with smaller poles and layers of brush and clay, creating an insulating ceiling that keeps the room cool in summer and warm in winter. A ventilator shaft brings in fresh air. A deflector stone between the fire pit and the shaft ensures that the draft does not blow out the flame. These elements were built with a precision that survives centuries. To sit in one is to feel insulated from the winds of the canyon and to hear voices in a soft echo that is unlike the echo a cliff gives. The room calibrates the senses. It slows time. It turns the mind to matters that do not belong to the market or the field. Archaeology can be too fond of categories. Practical, ceremonial, defensive, domestic. These headings sit neatly in field notes. The people who cut and used underground rooms did not need such partitions. A lava tube near a coma might store water in a dry year and host a rite at a season's turning. A cave in the San Francisco peaks might be a place to leave offerings for a spirit and a place to shelter from a summer storm in the same afternoon. A sinkhole on a high plain might be a place to dispose of household trash and a place where a child was warned not to play because the wind there has a voice. The underground in native North America is a continuum, not a set of boxes. The same chamber can be a ladder upward into ceremony and an anchor in a life of work. Beyond the modern borders of the United States, the Mesoamerican world contains perhaps the most elaborate expression of an American underworld. The Nahua told of Chickamaustock, the place of 7 caves, a mythic birthplace of peoples who later rose to rule. In Maya lands, the limestone is a sponge filled with conduits of clear water. Caves open like mouths and cenotes drop like wells into the green. These were portals to Xibalba, the realm beneath, where lords tested the living with trials of darkness and sound. The Maya carved altars in chambers where water dripped like a metronome. They left incense burners in galleries, lined with stalagmites that looked like a forest of stone. They built entire cities whose axes pointed to cave mouths, and whose names remembered the spring that bubbled at the base of a hill. The Mexica, whom the Spanish would call Aztecs, placed the entrance to the underworld in a mountain near modern Mexico City and marched their gods on processions that bound hill, cave, and temple into a single sacred machine. These traditions are not the subject of this chapter, except as cousins to the stories of the North. They show how the idea of a living underworld was continental in scope. It linked the ice caves of the Rockies to the sinkholes of the Yucatan in a family of beliefs about water, rock, and the path between worlds. If we return to the northern continent, we find the same idea surfacing in places that are not obviously cavernous. The Mississippian cities that rose along the great rivers carved the earth into mounds and plazas. The cedar-lined chambers at the center of some mounds contained burials and offerings that point to a view of the cosmos layered like a cake. Sky above, earth in the middle, underworld beneath. The 3 realms were joined by posts and by ceremonial axes that turned movement into a prayer. The people here were not miners of deep caves. Still, their burials reveal a fascination with creatures that belong to the watery below. The so-called underwater panther appears in engraved shell and in copper plates as a ruler of the realm under the surface. To dig into the earth to bury a leader was to speak with that realm and to ask for balance between the layers. Anthropologists who work with oral histories have learned to hear time in a different way when they listen to these traditions. A story about an emergence is not a fossil. It can absorb events and re-express them through a very old structure. When a people is driven from a homeland and must settle in a new one, the story of the passage between worlds becomes a way to interpret the loss and the return. When a river changes course and a flood erases fields, the story of a previous world that ended and a new world that began becomes a way to think about rebuilding. The underground is the place where a people waits and gathers strength, where they are instructed, where they bind themselves to one another, so that when they step out again into the light, they do so as a community and not as a crowd. There is also the simple fact that caves save lives. On the Colorado Plateau, summer storms can bring lightning and sheets of rain that turn arroyo beds into rivers in minutes. A family on a trek who ducks into a shallow cave while the storm passes out of sight from lightning finds the underground as hospitable as any built shelter. In winter, a deep cave that traps cold air can hold ice year-round, a natural storehouse. In summer, a cave with a steady breeze stays cool when the desert seems to glow. Lava tube ice caves in New Mexico hold crystals into late spring. Snowfields in the back of certain caves in the Sierra Nevada can be broken and carried to camp by people who have learned the track from grandparents. Ancient miners followed seams of mineral salts into darkness and left behind torch stubs stuck in clay walls like a bouquet. The underworld gives more than metaphors. It gives water, coolness, and a place to wait. The stories dignify that help and place it in a moral frame. A historian is tempted to collect these accounts like butterflies and pin them to the page with labels. The better course is to take them seriously as statements of how to live. The Hopi emergence story is inseparable from a code of conduct. The people left a world that had been corrupted by imbalance. They entered a new one under the guidance of powers that insisted on humility and on attention to the cycles of nature. The kiva is a classroom where those rules are taught by repetition. The Lakota emergence at Wind Cave is inseparable from the obligation to honor Paha Sapa and to fight for its dignity. The Paiute caution about enemies in caves was a way to warn children and to harden adults for the necessities of defense. Maya rites in deep chambers were inseparable from a water cult that required offerings for rain. These stories and practices work because they bind the practical to the sacred. They turn places into teachers. Modern visitors who come to these lands often carry a hunger for mystery. They hear phrases like the Ant People and the Seven Caves and imagine a continent riddled with tunnels that link Arizona to Mexico City in a literal line. There is a market for maps that show secret passages under the Grand Canyon and for stories in which ancient cities lie intact in chambers large enough to hold cathedrals. The record of archaeology does not support such visions. The passages that weave through sandstone and limestone are usually local in scale and irregular in form. They flood, collapse, and end abruptly. What runs for miles does so through loops and layers that do not invite easy travel. Where great cities did cut passages with intent, as at Teotihuacan, the tunnels were spiritual and symbolic, not highways for mass migration. The truth is impressive enough without embroidery. The people of the continent did not need a continent-wide subway. They had rivers, trails, and the sky, and they had stories that carried them where roads could not. There remains the question of how these traditions should be used in a book about underground cities and tunnels. The answer is that they frame our curiosity. When we go down into places like Derinkuyu in Turkey, we go with a vocabulary that belongs to states under siege and to engineers. When we enter a kiva or approach a cave that a tribe holds sacred, we enter a classroom, a church, and a courthouse. The behaviors expected are different. The permissions required are different. The claims about truth are different. A careful writer should not flatten them into the same thing. Instead, one should let each teach what it can. The engineered spaces tell us how people solved problems of survival with stone. The sacred spaces tell us why they thought survival mattered and whom they believed they were responsible to. It is striking that the same continent that holds the continent's longest cave systems also holds some of the oldest living traditions that teach reverence for the underworld. Kentucky's Mammoth Cave and its neighbors form a lacework of passages that at last count runs for hundreds of miles. The entrance area holds clear evidence of early mining and ritual. Charred torch ends have been recovered and dated to several thousand years ago. A body was found centuries later under a rockfall, the bones preserved by the dry air. A reminder that these places are not museums, but work sites where accidents happen. In Utah and Nevada, dry caves yielded sandals whose weaving patterns are distinct enough that archaeologists can trace groups by the style of their shoes. In New Mexico, lava tubes carry soot marks and ash deposits that match dates when people would have needed to store water or to take shelter. These data points stitch into the tapestry that the stories name. The underground is a resource and a realm. It is a place to be treated with caution and respect. There is one more lesson worth drawing from the underground worlds of the first peoples. These stories are often told as if they look backward only. They, in fact, look forward. The act of entering the kiva again and again through the year says that emergence is not a one-time event. A community must loom toward the light repeatedly. It must remember the rules that make life in a harsh landscape possible. It must balance work with ceremony, taking with giving, confidence with humility. When outsiders arrive with cameras and maps, the best response is to move carefully and to listen. The ground will still be there when we learn to hear it speak. From the high desert to the cedar swamps, from the karst country of the Ozarks to the mouth of Wind Cave, the continent gathers these voices and gives them a common rhythm. The rhythm is simple. Life rises, life falls, life waits below, life returns. The rooms under the earth are not dead ends, they are classrooms and cradles. A child standing at the edge of a sipapu and watching a ritual leader speak will grow up with a sense that the line between worlds is thin. That sense has kept people alive through drought and invasion and loss. It has given them a duty to the places where they stand. It has given us a different way to read the land, not as a surface to be paved, but as a layered home. The road into Teotihuacan is straightforward. The city itself never was. From a distance, the valley looks like any other basin of central Mexico, a floor of fields encircled by low hills with mountains beyond. Then the shapes rise. Pyramids lift from the plain like slopes of quarried earth frozen in mid-climb. The long north-south avenue that archaeologists call the Avenue of the Dead pulls the eye toward the Pyramid of the Moon and away again toward the Pyramid of the Sunday. It is a city that announces order and monument in equal measure. Yet for every stone that seems to speak above ground, there is a quiet reply from below. The Teotihuacanos built a world on the surface and a world beneath it, and their deepest secrets remained sealed for nearly 2,000 years. Teotihuacan flourished between the 1st and 7th centuries of the Common Era. At its height, it covered more than 20 square kilometers and sheltered well over 100,000 people. Some scholars argue for a population that reached 200,000, which would make it one of the largest cities in the world in its time. It was a planned city. The builders imposed a grid that tilted about 15 degrees east of north and then set monumental complexes along its spine. Apartment compounds ringed courtyards and sheltered extended families in neighborhoods often associated with particular crafts or places of origin. Walls wore murals that glowed with red iron oxide and the blues and greens that copper can give when coaxed by an artist's hand. Public buildings presented the stepped profile of talud and tablero, a sloping panel below with a framed vertical panel above, repeated like the cadence of a marching song. The city projected order at every scale. Ancient Mesoamerica celebrated the three-layered cosmos of sky, earth, and underworld. To build any city here was to stage a conversation between these realms. Teotihuacan's planners set that conversation in stone. The Pyramid of the Sun stands over a cave. That cave is not an incidental feature like a utility corridor in a modern basement. It is almost certainly one reason the pyramid sits where it does. When explorers widened the entrance in the early 20th century and traced the passage inward, they found a natural lava tube expanded by hand into a four-chambered cloverleaf. If one were looking for a place where the earth was already thin, a place where the world below met the world above, this would be it. The cave's position under the axis of the largest pyramid suggests the city used natural topography to call forth the sacred. Where nature offered a door, the builders framed it with a mass that still commands the horizon. Farther south, along the avenue, stands the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, also known as the Temple of Quetzalcoatl. Its facade bears serpent heads that thrust from the tablero, each head framed by feathered collars, and between them a different monster face, with round eyes and fangs that may stand for a war or storm deity. In the early 1900s, the temple looked like a low mound to many visitors. By mid-century, excavations revealed the reliefs and the talud tablero rhythm beneath later buildings. The structure became a textbook of Teotihuacan art. A deeper revelation waited below. In 2003, while repairing a storm-damaged platform just south of the temple, archaeologists noticed a small sinkhole. When a camera was lowered into the gap, it recorded a void that had been sealed since antiquity. The National Institute of Anthropology and History began a multi-year investigation. Over time, led by Sergio Gomez, the team opened a shaft and passed through a stone plug into a tunnel that ran more than 100 meters toward the very heart of the ceremonial precinct. The air smelled dead and old, a scent of dust and minerals. The floor had been laid with pebbles and packed clay. The walls and ceiling were coated in places with a metallic sheen that glinted under lamplight like a field of stars. Those stars were cunning. The ancient builders had crushed pyrite into powder and sprinkled the glittering dust into the wet plaster of the tunnel. When held under torchlight, the particles sparkled as if the night sky had been caught and smeared along the vault. In chambers near the far end of the tunnel, archaeologists found hundreds of mysterious spheres as large as oranges, made by shaping clay or stone and then coating them with a crust of pyrite or magnetite. The purpose of these spheres is still debated. They may have been ritual devices, their surfaces reflecting light as participants moved through darkness. The tunnel thus became a cosmic corridor, a model of the watery and star-filled underworld that Mesoamerican peoples imagined beneath the earth. The finds deepened. Offerings lay in layers that spoke of long planning. There were delicate carved shells that had traveled from far coasts. There were jaguar bones, wolf bones, and the remains of birds of prey, animals that the Teotihuacanos regarded as companions of power. There were odd collections of flat green stones, likely jadeite from distant mines, and there were figures fashioned from the greenstone that Mesoamerica prized. There were wooden objects preserved by the airless chamber and worked in ways rarely seen because wood so rarely survives. Perhaps most startling were pools and traces of a shining liquid that clung to corners and depressions in the floor. Tests identified it as liquid mercury. Mercury is rare in the ancient world as an intentional ritual substance. Ores of cinnabar are common enough in Mexico, and cinnabar was ground into a red pigment used across Teotihuacan's palaces and tombs. To heat cinnabar and distill its quicksilver demands knowledge and effort. The presence of mercury in the tunnel suggests an intention to create a reflective surface like water that would not evaporate in a sealed chamber. In a civilization where caves and springs were portals to the world below, pools that mirrored the torchlight like rivers of metal would have carried a powerful meaning. The tunnel was not a passage for ordinary movement. It was a place where an initiated few enacted a cosmology in the glow of full stars and mirrored streams. At the tunnel's end lay 3 chambers off the main axis, not unlike the cloverleaf under the pyramid of the Sunday. They may have represented the womb of the earth or the triadic heart of the underworld. Gomez's team has posited that the tunnel was used to install or even to inter the remains of the city's highest rulers. Teotihuacan does not give up royal names easily. We do not have carved stelae that recite dynasties as at later Maya sites. Yet the sheer scale of the offerings at this terminus suggests that sovereigns or founding ancestors were honored here. The city's ideology, which tends to present the state and the cosmos together rather than to celebrate individual kings, would be well served by a sacred axis that celebrated rulership as a cosmic function rather than a personal brand. As the southern tunnel came to light, another discovery began to take shape beneath the Pyramid of the Moon. This pyramid anchors the north end of the Avenue of the Dead and frames the skyline with the low volcano of Cerro Gordo beyond. The structure grew through several construction phases, each a larger shell that enveloped an earlier pyramid. That practice is common across Mesoamerica. It preserves the sanctity of a place while expanding its capacity. In 2017, a team used electrical resistivity tomography to peer under the plaza and into the pyramid's foundations. The imaging revealed a void beneath the center of the plaza that extended toward the pyramid and likely under it at a depth of around 10 meters. A tunnel, in other words, had been cut or followed there as well. The Moon Complex has yielded rich burials in the past, including individuals offered with obsidian blades and animal companions that symbolized status and war. A tunnel at its heart fits the pattern seen at the Feathered Serpent precinct. The ancient city appears to have created subterranean corridors at its most sacred nodes. These were not mine galleries or drains. They were anchors of ceremony that mirrored the buildings above. In this sense, Teotihuacan's grand plan worked in 2 directions. The visible city offered geometry to the sky. The invisible city offered passages to the underworld. The question of purpose brings us to the broader life of Teotihuacan. This was a martial and mercantile power. Its art celebrates warriors with butterfly pectorals and headdresses. Its obsidian workshop sent blades across the highlands and beyond. The city influenced or dominated trade routes that delivered feathers, shells, salt, cacao, and greenstone. Its emissaries traveled far into Maya country. On a day remembered in later Maya inscriptions as the arrival of a new fire, a man connected to Teotihuacan named Siaj Kak came to Tikal in the year 378. A reshaping of power followed. From that year forward, Tikal's monuments show Teotihuacano symbols and dress. The tunnels beneath Teotihuacan's temples therefore belong to a state whose reach extended across Mesoamerica. Whatever rites were enacted in the darkness were connected to a politics that mattered from the Gulf to the Pacific, and from the Basin of Mexico to the Piton. The city was also religious in a way that political states here often were. The cult of the storm god and the cult of a feathered serpent appear in murals and on sculpture. Ritual fires burned on altars. Processions moved along the avenue. Priests and officials presided over rites that bound neighborhoods to the state, and the state to the cycles of rain and maize. The underworld in central Mexican thought was not only a place of the dead, it was a watery matrix from which life came and to which life returned. Springs and caves were mouths of that realm. A tunnel filled with symbols of water and stars would be an axis where power and fertility met. The people above could not all enter, but when they saw incense rise from temple tops and heard drums pulse across the plazas, they would know that a hidden circuit below had been completed. As archaeologists cleared the southern tunnel, they used technologies that have become the standard for careful work in sealed environments. Small drones and remote cameras scanned for hazards. LIDAR mapped subtle variations in surface that could reveal hidden voids. Ground-penetrating radar traced anomalies. The excavation proceeded by inches. Soil was bagged and screened. The slightest shard was catalogued with the unit and level recorded. When mercury was detected, precautions were taken to avoid exposure. The process could be maddeningly slow for a field that often works in seasons rather than in weeks, yet the patience paid off because the tunnel had never been looted. Every bead and shard lay where a hand had placed it in antiquity. That is rare in the archaeology of power. Teotihuacan did not keep secrets forever. Sometime in the 6th century, perhaps after a severe drought, perhaps after political upheaval, the city faltered. There is evidence of burning in elite compounds and a halt in building at the monumental core. The apartments of ordinary people continued to be occupied for a time. Then the population thinned. By the time the Mexica reached the valley centuries later, the city was a ruin covered with scrub and mystery. They named it Teotihuacan, the place where gods were made, a poetic reading of the giant shapes that had outlasted their makers. They associated caves with the underworld and linked the Pyramid of the Sun to a hole in the earth, just as the original builders had done. Aztec royalty made pilgrimages here. The city lived on as an origin point, even when its name and stories were lost. Modern work at Teotihuacan has revealed the practical city as well as the sacred. Excavations of apartment compounds show planned drainage and raised stone walkways that crossed courtyards. Kitchens were placed near drains. Shrines stood in domestic spaces where families performed daily rites. Workshops were set along streets that allowed potters and lapidaries to receive raw material and deliver finished goods. The underworld logic extended into this ordinary life. Many compounds had small altars above and modest drains and channels below. Water was managed so that it would not pool and rot the living spaces. Household burials sometimes lie under floors. The world below supported the world above in the most literal way. The discovery of tunnels has also reframed debates about how the city ruled. For decades, scholars argued whether Teotihuacan was a classic kingdom with kings or a more corporate state whose elite shared power in committees and councils. The lack of named rulers on monuments encouraged the corporate view. The presence of a ritual axis under the feathered serpent temple and the likely installation of royal ancestors there encourages a more kingly reading without requiring a single absolute monarch. The city may have celebrated an idea of rulership that was deliberately impersonal above ground, while investing that idea with intense ceremony below ground. The public eyes saw gods and armies. The initiated eyes saw a corridor where the bones of founders lay in the glow of mica and pyrite. There are other underground features worth noting. Beneath some plazas, archaeologists have identified drains and culverts that not only carried away stormwater, but also staged the presence of water in ritual. In certain seasons, the plaza before the Pyramid of the Moon may have been allowed to flood in a controlled way, creating a reflective surface that doubled the mass of the pyramid in the eye. The builders did this sort of water theater at other Mesoamerican sites, and the presence of a tunnel beneath that plaza strengthens the sense that Teotihuacan used both engineering and symbol to bind the city to the sky and the earth. The city's underground will continue to surprise. Many rooms on the surface remain covered by meters of wind-blown soil and rubble from ancient collapses. Every new survey seems to reveal a void where no one expected one. Because the ancient builders often respected earlier sacred spaces when they expanded a temple, tunnels and caves can persist under later constructions, like a memory that refuses to be erased. Conservation complicates the process of revelation. To open a tunnel is to expose ancient plaster and pigments to air, and to a flow of visitors that can cause damage. The custodians of Teotihuacan have learned to be cautious, to open windows into the past without tearing down the house that protects it. To walk Teotihuacan today is to feel both the power of the planned surface and the pull of the unknown below. You climb the Pyramid of the Sun and look across a valley where neighborhoods stretch like a chessboard to the hills. You sit on a step and feel the warmth of stone. You descend and enter a small museum and see a jade mask whose eyes once glittered in the firelight of a temple. You pass a grate in the plaza where a faint breath of cooler air rises from below. A child rubs the dust from a shoe on the edge of the grate and looks down into shadows. Somewhere beneath, the glitter of pyrite might still cling to a ceiling, waiting for a torch that will never come. It is a city that knew how to make the earth speak in two voices. The story of Teotihuacan's tunnels teaches a final lesson about the human habit of building under the ground. The people who carved these corridors did not do so out of fear alone. They did it to stage a drama about creation and authority. The state did not hide. It descended. The priests and rulers did not flee. They entered a corridor made to look like the night and walked toward chambers that represented the womb of the earth. In that darkness, they left offerings that took time and skill to assemble. They did so to ensure rain and maize, to secure victory and fertility, to tie the city to a cosmos that was as much water as fire. The modern visitor can only imagine the sensation of seeing a torch flare on pyrite stars and of hearing the sound of a conch trumpet bounce down a plastered hall. Yet the archaeology allows imagination to rest on facts. The tunnels were real. The pools of quicksilver shimmered. The underworld was not only a word, it was a place. The Picard Plateau north of Amiens looks gentle to the eye. Wheat sways in even rows. Orchards lean into the light, and a band of oak and beech crowns the high ground like a careful hedge. Nothing in that pastoral scene hints that a town once retreated under these fields and woods in times of danger. Yet beneath the turf lies Naours, a honeycomb of galleries and chambers cut into chalk, the largest underground refuge of its kind in northern France. For centuries it was a secret the villagers kept and used, a city of last resort with its own streets, chapels, stables, and bakeries. A place where the life of a community could continue when the surface was unsafe. Even now, when visitors file past white walls marked with candle soot, Naours feels less like a ruin and more like a house held in trust. The stone itself explains the opportunity. Northern France is rich in chalk. a soft, calcareous rock laid down in the age of shallow seas. The soil above is loam and loess, good for farms and also quick to shed water. Where wind and rain have cut the plateau, the chalk stands at a clean face. The Romans and their medieval heirs quarried it in blocks to build churches and houses, and they dug it in sheets for lime kilns. Naors began its recorded life as such a quarry. Men opened the face and removed the good stone, leaving behind a series of shallow rooms and tunnels in which the marks of picks zigzagged like stitching. When the quarrymen moved on, they left a skeleton of chambers that could be enlarged with less effort than fresh rock would have demanded. A need for shelter soon turned a work site into a refuge. The Middle Ages in Picardy were not a single story, but a rhythm of war and quiet. This band of country sat astride routes that armies used when kings and dukes pressed their claims. As the crowns of France and England fought, as Burgundian power rose and fell, as the wars of religion brought raiders in bands large and small, villages in Picardy learned to think in layers. You tended the field in ordinary time, but you also kept a key to a door near a copse where chalk began, and the first stairs down had been cut. You knew which neighbor held a lamp and who would bring a sack of grain when the alarm ran. There is an old term in the area for such havens, much used in archival notes and on old maps. They are called muches. Naors is the most famous and the most elaborate of these muches. By the later medieval period, the complex at Naors had grown into a system of roughly 2 miles of galleries, arranged along a ridge that lies about 100 feet below the surface. In that world, the villagers built a city that mirrored the one above in miniature. The carvers cut rooms in lines and clusters, sometimes arranged along corridors wide enough for a few people to pass with baskets. They opened squares where a dozen could gather, and they fitted corners for chapels with a shallow apse and a simple altar block. They dug wells that bit into a perched water table so that a family could draw clean water without risk of emerging at the wrong moment. They built ovens for bread, and they set aside stalls for animals on the uppermost levels where air was better and the smell was more easily borne. There were storage rooms with niches for oil lamps and pegs for family gear. There were rooms for resting, rooms for keeping watch, rooms that children learned to find without stumbling in the dark. The plan of Naors was not random. As the labyrinth grew, the builders tried to impose a legible order. Some passages carry names recorded by early modern visitors, recalling the trades or families who used them. There are signs of an attempt to give the place a civic structure. Areas near chapels and a larger square read like neighborhoods. A visitor today can trace the logic by the way the rooms repeat, by the spread of soot on ceilings, and by the proximity of wells to kitchens. The measure of the place is given in numbers that still surprise. More than 300 man-made rooms have been counted. The total capacity has been estimated in the low thousands. Contemporary accounts from the early modern period speak of shelter for as many as 3,000 souls. That figure likely represents the maximum possible in an emergency and not a comfortable head count for a long stay. Even so, it shows the ambition of the project. Naors was a refuge for a region, not a bolt hole for one hamlet. The entrances were placed and hidden with care. Some opened in hollow lanes screened by hedges, others in the back rooms of barns, where a door cut into chalk would be hard to spot by a stranger. Ventilation meant survival. The builders pierced shafts to the surface and masked them in thickets or within hollow trees. Chimneys were flued so that smoke could escape through a scatter of small outlets rather than a single plume that would betray a mass of people below. The chalk made this possible. It is firm enough to hold a clean cut when the span is modest, and soft enough that a few men with picks and sledges could extend a passage by several paces in a day. The work left its own map in candle scores and pick lines. Even without a plan, one feels a rhythm of labor that lasted generations. History placed Niort under pressure again and again. The 16th century was unkind to Picardy. France's wars of religion turned quiet places into marching grounds. Company-sized units would strip a village of grain, salt, and animals for a day and call it tax. Refugees brought stories of towns put to the torch. Under such conditions, a city beneath the ground is less a curiosity than a covenant. Families learned to move quickly. Bed frames and heavy furniture stayed above, but the objects of living that a family could carry went below in sacks and baskets. A baker would shield his leaven with his own body. A priest would carry a portable cup and paten. Mothers kept an order in their heads for who would descend first, who would mind the smallest children, who would check the well, who would claim the oven. It is the ordinariness of this planning that moves a reader of parish registers and local accounts. In quiet years, the much lay empty except for repairs and a bit of storage. In fearful weeks, the much was a town again. There is evidence that the site was used not only in great wars, but also in the smaller, grinding contests that flow around a border. Picardy felt the push and pull of the Habsburg and Bourbon contest. It suffered raids by both regular troops and free companies. Niort appears in reports as a place of resort during periods of Spanish pressure and during the disturbances of the Fronde. The complex was never a fortress in the sense of bastions and cannon. It was a place to disappear and to outwait. Its defenses were discretion and depth. A soldier could not assault what he could not properly find. Plugs of chalk could be set to seal a branch for a time, and then pried out again when the right hands returned. The record of Niort does not end with the early modern. The 19th century brought a different kind of attention. In the 1880s, a local priest and amateur historian began to document the catacombs and caves of the region with an eye to preserving their memory. The plateau above Niort suffered a collapse in a pasture that revealed an entrance. Local authorities and scholars descended to explore. Whitewash and simple walls were added in places to stabilize areas for safe passage. Labels were painted for the benefit of visitors. The underground city entered a new era as a site of curiosity and pride. Guides led parties through rooms where the air held the old cool and the scent of candle smoke was buried in chalk. Then came the first of the great wars of the 20th century. The Western Front rolled across Picardy with a violence that the people of the plateau had not imagined possible. The front line passed not many miles east of Niort. The deadliest year for the Somme Valley was 1916. The fields north of the city of Amiens swarmed with men in uniforms from every corner of an empire. Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, and British troops rotated between trenches and billets. On rare days of rest, some were sent on tours of local sites designed to lift spirits and give the men an hour's relief from the thought of mud and wire. Niort was one of those sites. Soldiers descended with guides and lanterns and, like many visitors in underground places, they left their names. In recent years, researchers have counted thousands of inscriptions left by soldiers during the First World War. The names carry dates most often from 1916 and 1917. There are units, hometowns, and the small boasts that any visitor makes, a claim of presence that says, "I walked here when it mattered to me." Many of the signatures belong to Australians who fought on the Somme and who would later carry the memory of Picardy home across oceans. The hand is steady in some, hasty in others, scratched in a hurry perhaps as a sergeant called the section to move along. A few inscriptions carry a sad epilogue. Military records allow historians to match a name carved in chalk to a file that tells of a death later in the year. The underground city thus holds a register of young lives who walked away from the guns for a day and saw a different kind of refuge. The Second World War drew attention to Niort in a different tone. The German occupation of northern France used underground spaces in a practical way. In some cases, German units stored material in caves because chalk holds an even temperature and keeps powder dry. In other cases, they denied access to locals for fear such spaces would shelter resistance or hide radios. Niort's proximity to major lines of communication made it valuable, and local memory holds that sections were controlled by the occupier for part of the war. The details are fragmentary, as such details often are when a town survives an invasion by staying quiet. After liberation, the site returned to its role as a local monument and a thread of continuity. How did Niort function when it had to serve as a city and not as a showpiece? The answer begins with light. Everything underground begins with light. Oil lamps burned carefully. Wicks were trimmed with attention. Reflectors could be fashioned from polished metal to throw more light on a work surface. Spare fuel was hoarded, and a watchman would have been appointed in each corridor to see that lamps did not burn without need. Next came air. The shaft openings were checked to see that they remained clear of leaves and snow. Families knew which doors to open on a sequence, so the draft would pull the heavy air from low rooms without turning a corridor into a wind tunnel. Water management came third. Wells allowed communities to avoid the temptation to climb, but condensation will still bead on chalk when many bodies share close quarters. Floors were cut with shallow swales to gather drips and spills and to carry them towards sumps. Children were warned not to play near these sumps. Health depends on such small disciplines. Food in a refuge is measured by time and labor. Niort was not a place where luxury could be preserved. Bread baked in small loaves to speed the heat of the oven. Meat appears to have been smoked and salted above ground, and only warmed below for fear of filling the air with grease. Dairying followed the rhythm of the animals that were brought down for a time, and then hastened back up when the danger lessened. The chalk keeps an even cool that helps cheese, but brine and patience are still needed. Wine keeps well in chalk. Even today, wine merchants in northern France love a chalk cellar for the way it holds a temperature, just cool enough to tame the wine to age. The same was true in the early modern. It is not hard to imagine a cask tapped to give courage to parents who spent their third night with children on a stone bench while news from the road was uncertain. Religion followed the people below. The chapels at Niort are simple. An altar block, a cross carved or painted, a niche for a lamp, perhaps a scrap of plaster preserved where a saint once stood in color. In one or two places, the ceiling is painted with a simple border, as if to remind the gathered that beauty belongs even in need. A priest with a small chalice could say a mass that fit the hard space of a refuge. Baptisms could be performed with a cup of clean water drawn from a well a few rooms away. Funerary rites could be read in a low voice, with neighbors standing in a half circle. The procession laid aside until light returned, and the surface could receive a grave. It would be easy to paint the life of Niort in somber colors only. That would miss the point. The underground city exists because the people above believed in their own continuity. They did not go below to give up. They went below to save what they were, until the moment came to rise. The stories told in Picardy linger on small things that carry that spirit. A young couple who spoke their vows in a chapel below because a raid had closed the church. A baker who made his rounds along a corridor and left a crust on the bench of an old woman who was too tired to rise. A child shown the proper way to snuff a lamp with a twist so that the wick would not smoke when relit. These are the details that make Naors feel like a living memory rather than a museum display. The modern stewardship of the site understands this double truth. Conservation teams have to stabilize chalk that wants to flake when exposed to the breath of thousands of visitors. They have to manage humidity and crowd size, to trim electrical light so that algae does not bloom on damp places, and to protect the most fragile inscriptions so that a finger will not turn a century-old name to dust. At the same time, they have to keep the rooms from becoming theatrical. The best tours let the chalk speak. They let visitors hear the quiet and feel the slight wind that a shaft draws on a day when the weather changes above. They point out the practical, the way a doorway is set slightly off-axis to frustrate a draft, the way a niche sits always on the right because the carver favored his strongest arm, the way a well head bears the notches of rope that tell a story of years no chronicle recorded. The research continues. Scholars who study the First World War now mine the Naors inscriptions to trace the path of individual soldiers across the Somme and beyond. Australian historians take particular interest because so many of the signatures belong to men from Queensland and Victoria who came to a land whose language and weather were strange and who shared an afternoon with a guide in a chalk city they could scarcely have imagined existed. Some of those names are matched to letters home that mention the outing, and in those letters, Naors becomes a human place where a man laughed for a moment before a week of terror. The underground holds that human note, even as it carries the weight of much older centuries. As with all places that mix strong memory and clean engineering, Naors invites comparison. The chalk quarries under Arras served as barracks and assault tunnels in the Great War, a hard military use rather than a civilian one. The British named the galleries after places at home and left signs in chalk as soldiers always do. At Laon and Soissons, other underground sites preserve the scratch of candles and the geometry of hurried work in soft stone. Orvieto in Italy shows a similar pairing of peace and defense, but in volcanic tuff rather than chalk. The Paris catacombs are a different order of subterranean world, a vast ossuary born of quarrying and of the pressure of a growing city. Against that variety, Naors stands out for the way it kept the domestic in view. Its chapels are small, its squares intimate, its doors of a scale for a family and a neighbor. What, finally, does Naors teach in a book about the cities under our feet? It teaches that communities are capable of long planning when the need is clear. It teaches that ordinary people will invest labor in a shared refuge even when the day is sunny and the harvest looks good, because they remember the season when riders appeared on a ridge without warning. It teaches that the border between war and peace is not a line, but a habit, and that the habit of keeping an exit that leads down can be as wise as building a wall that points up. It teaches that children learn resilience not as a speech in a school, but as a lesson in lamp wicks and stair steps, and that such lessons endure when books are lost. Stand again on the plateau and look at the woods. Hear the wind through leaves and the faint sound of a tractor far off. Below, a corridor runs straight and then bends, and a name from the year 1916 waits in a small hand that believed the chalk would hold its mark. Naors is a place where farmers and priests, bakers and carpenters, soldiers on leave and scholars with notebooks, all shared the same cool air and the same sense that stone can be a friend. The ground in Picardy is thick with history. Naors is its quiet heart.